Hello friends, welcome to JavaEE EJB JPA tutorial. You are watching JPA entity subseries. Now we are at part 5 and here we will learn about Entity Manager. Then we will use the Entity Manager inside the Stateless Session Bean. And this Stateless Session Bean will talk to the entity which we created in part 12 and part 11. So the stateless bean will act as a remote object which can be accessed by the client application, and then this stateless bean will talk to our entity manager, because entity cannot be exposed as a remote object, and so we use stateless session bean, which is a remote object, and that will interact with the entity through entity manager. So these are all the preview from previous parts. So in the previous video, we talked about the JPA tools. Now we will learn about Entity Manager. So the Entity Manager is an interface which will provide functionality to manage entities. So in our case, saving account is an entity, and in this video we will use this Entity Manager to manage that specific entity savings account. For example, one can search for an entity, add and remove entities to the database using the Entity Manager. An Entity Manager is marked with persistent context. When we go to the example, you will see. So this persistence context annotation will tell the Entity Manager will manage a specific entity on a specific entity project. So it talks about the database connection detail to the Entity Manager. With this in the sense, with this persistent context, Entity Manager knows in which database it deals with the entities. So this is one method, find method. The find method of the Entity Manager finds an entity instance based on the ID column. So in our savings account class, we defined a ID column, as well as the ID column is a auto-generated field. So when we are inserting, the column value will be provided by the SQL server, and the find method of the Entity Manager will make use of that key column, generated value column, and finds an instance. Then the persist method will persist the entity information to the database. So the Entity Manager is smart enough to know whether it needs to insert or it needs to update. So if the entity is new based on this ID, the entity manager will create a new row in the database, and if ID already exists, then entity manager will perform an update. So in this example, we will create a remote interface. If you see, our remote interface name is saving account bean remote, and we are defining a method new account. So the client application will make use of this bean method new account. Then it tells account holder name and initial balance. So based on this, we can create a new row in the database. And if you see here, the method is not taking any ID. Why? Because the ID is an auto-generated column. So when we ask the entity manager to persist the new entity, the entity will supply account holder name as well as initial balance, and the database will auto-generate the ID based on the seed and incremental step value. Alright, here if you see, we have a remote bean and a method is declared here, new account. Next, in the implementation class of the bean, here we are declaring an entity manager. So here an object that implements entity manager interface will get created, and we annotate that with persistence context. Here unit name, we are giving it as a savings account. So in the persistence.xml, the unit name is a JPA saving account. So now the entity manager knows, it goes to the persistent manager and it finds this unit name. Then it knows what is the data source name and what are all the entity classes. At present we have MS SQL DS, so that's the data source name which Wildfly talks to the PUBs database of the SQL server on this local machine. So that connection detail will be there as part of this persistent unit. Then we have one class name in the persistence.xml. So now the entity manager object created knows where is the database connection and what are all the object it will manage. What are all the object in the sense, what are all the entities. So at present we have only one entity. The entity is a savings account. Database is PUBs. Then here we define our method new account, and if you see, first we are creating a savings account. So this is our entity which we created in the previous videos. The savings account is from the JPA entity project, I mean in the JPA project. So we are creating an instance of that entity savings account. Then using this account reference, we are setting the balance and we are setting the name. Those are all coming here as parameters. So at this stage our entity object is ready with the populated field. Balance is populated and name also populated with some value. So the entity object is ready, and EM is our entity manager. em.persist here we are calling, and we are supplying this newly created entity. So what happens, this em.persist will store this entity instance inside our database. That means, so this is an instance, right? So in the theory part we talked about each instance will represent a row. So that means when we make a call to persist, this instance, savings account instance, is stored, or it will be stored in the database. So B will get stored in the corresponding column, name also will get stored in the corresponding column, ID will be auto generated. So if this is the first time we are or if this is the very first row and very first time we are persisting, the seed will be 1 and record will be created with a key column of 1 and whatever information we supplied here. Next, our method returns the new ID. Here if you see account dot get PID. So when we are persisting, that time if you see account is having the value for balance and account holder name. So the database will generate the ID and it will give it back to us. So that's why here we are accessing this same account object and we are asking to give me the PID. So the PID will be returned here, and 1 that we are returning it to the caller. Caller in the sense this is a remote method, right? So there will be a JSP or servlet we will decide in the next video. So that one will get the newly created records key column value. That's what we are returning it. So now it's demo time. Let's go ahead and implement our second layer, I mean the Java Bean layer. So now we will create our Bean object. So now we choose our EJB Bean. So it contains 2 beans from our previous 2 example. Now this time we are going to create a bean under this stateless bean category. So we will use this same package. Here I'm choosing new session bean. Package name we are choosing stateless bean. So this should be a stateless bean, and we'll ask for a remote interface. Then we will click next here. So mapped name I am giving the same name as of bean. Next we are clicking finish here. So now we will go to our bean client, and if you see, this is our bean class saving AC bean, implements saving AC bean remote, which will be here in the bean client project. Saving AC bean remote. So you can control click here, which will directly land to this location. Here if you see, we define our first interface method, new account. So we will look at the code operation, that means so in the code C is here creating new account. Update and delete stuff we will learn in the next video series. So deleting the account or updating the account, we will see it in the next series. Now once we added this interface method, you can see a red cross mark is appearing on our saving account bin, which we already opened here. So here first we need to declare our persistent manager. So import persistence context from javaex.persistence, then entity manager from same package location javaex.persistence. Alright, so to the persistent context we are giving the unit name as JPA savings account. So ignore this error for now, it's because of the implementation that is missing right now. Here in the JPA savings account, if I open persistence.xml, you can see the name is JPA savings account. That is the persistence unit name, and you can see that here also persistence unit name is JPA savings account. So here we are referring that JPA savings account unit name. So once we specify this persistent context, when Wildfly is creating the entity manager instance, it knows that the entity manager instance is connecting to the data source specified by this JNDI name. That means it will connect to the SQL Server database, and SQL Server instance running on this local machine, and it goes to the pubs database. So that's what here we defined in this. Then the entity manager also knows that it is going to manage the only one entity that is specified here in between these tags, persistent unit savings account. Alright, now persistent manager is ready. Now we will click here and choose add unimplemented method. So this code was already explained in the slide, and if you see here, import savings account from tube.codingexamples.jpa.entity. So here it is saying import the JPA entity. Suppose in your case, if this import statement is not appearing, then you have to go to properties, go for deployment assembly, and add the project reference. So here I'm choosing tube.codingexamples.jpa entity, and then I'm saving it. So that's all here. We imported our entity, and we will test this by writing a JSP file in the next video. Okay, we will start the server and check this once. So our server is started, and no error here. Okay, we will stop the server. Server is stopped. So that's all here in this video. We created a bean that makes use of EntityManager and tries to persist the information into the database. Here we had written a code to create new savings account. That's all here in this video. Thank you for watching. Bye.